Hello and welcome to Mr. Clark After Dark, everyone. My name is Lucas Clark and I am a certified educator with Alberta Education and the Alberta Teachers Association. All conversations and interactions exchanged is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. In no way does the content discussed intend to be in violation of the ATA Code of Conduct or to deliberately target any individual student, teacher, or to belittle or demean the profession in any way. If you have something that you would like me to discuss or have a story of your own to share, please reach out at mrclarkafterdark@gmail.com, or you can also send me a direct message on Instagram at Mr. Clark After Dark. Hope you all enjoy the show, and please do not forget to subscribe. Today I have on the one and only Jason Schilling. Jason Schilling is currently the president of the Alberta Teachers Association and has been in the profession for 27 years. On this episode, Jason and I discuss student-teacher violence, the classroom size cap not coming to Alberta despite being present in others, central bargaining versus local bargaining, PECBA legislation and bargaining for what you would like to bargain for, how there are already solutions to major teacher issues but we are just not being listened to, what level students are being funded at compared to other provinces, teacher engagement, the teaching quote-unquote scope of practice, how we cannot just assess students out of learning gaps, changing expectations for teachers, that not every teacher has to do everything, blaming parents for his decision to run for president, coping strategies teachers create after the death of a student, carrying the burden and guilt of an unfortunate incident of a student within his own classroom, grief pacing and processing secondary trauma, lighting the torch, trying to contend with policy decisions during COVID, as well as the quote-unquote tone change between the previous Lagrange Ministry and the current Nicolaides Ministry. And of course, much more. Thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the show. Happy New Year. All right, want to get going?
Yep.
All right. So, Mr. Schilling, thanks for coming on. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So this is your first ever interview, is that correct?
Yeah, I've never done an interview before.
Never
this
done
is
it
my
before?
first time, so please ask really easy questions.
Yeah, okay. So, president of the ATA, why be a teacher?
Why be a teacher? Because I think teaching's great. I know that there's a lot of issues and concerns in the field and in schools and in public education, but I actually can't imagine doing anything else. To me, it's a great job. Working with students is always rewarding. Sometimes it's challenging, and some days you leave the day going, I don't know about this, right? But then other times, I was just talking about this actually the other day with some folks about this notion that, there's a lot of challenges in education, but there's also a lot of joy that goes with education when you're teaching students in your classroom and when you have that lesson where everything just kind of clicks and the kids get it and they're engaged and it's just working really well. And, kids are funny, they're sarcastic, they're smart, they're challenging.
See, and so It was actually refreshing the other day. I had a conversation with someone because the common narrative is, students are only getting worse, like they're just on their phones all the time, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the teachers actually said to me, I think kids are actually getting better. Like, I think they're like getting more funny and they're like wittier and they're more sarcastic and they're kind of like older humor because we're kind of all sharing the same kind of social media landscape. So we're all kind of a little bit more universal in that regard, which was a little refreshing. But like for some of the issues and concerns for you kind of being the ATA president now, what are some of the main issues and concerns that you would like to address or that you feel the association is addressing?
Is or isn't addressing? Because we address all of them, but I mean, it's to various degrees of success sometimes. And that's one of the biggest challenges of this job is, these are issues and concerns. And so you advocate and you work towards finding solutions that are actually going to work in the classroom and not make teachers' lives more complicated or difficult or add one more thing to somebody's plate who doesn't have room on that plate to add anything. But right now we're really having conversations right now with the government around violence and aggression that we're seeing in schools. So we're seeing sort of we just had our last provincial executive council meeting about 2 weeks ago, and that was the common thread and the theme throughout. That was just, we're seeing more students kind of being aggressive with each other and with teachers and other adults who are working in the building. So we need to address that issue head on, and that's going to require government, that's going to require school boards, and CAS, which is the Superintendents Association, sort of working together to find solutions to move that forward.
Is this like a resurgence of something? Like, what is there? Has there just been an uptick recently, or?
It's always, I think, been around, but I think we're seeing more of it being reported.
Okay.
Right? And more incidents happening as well. And I think it's a little bit of a carryover of the pandemic. So students were coming out of this situation, higher mental health needs of our students. We don't have the resources, the supports for them. I mean, I worked in a small school in southern Alberta. We have a counselor who comes in once a week. That's not enough to provide support to students once a week. And they were busy enough as it was. So try to add another case to their caseload. They're, just like teachers and other professionals going, I don't know where I'm going to find the time to do this. So that's one of the issues that we're looking at as well. Class size is an issue definitely across a lot of jurisdictions.
Why does there seem to be class size caps in some provinces and then not in Alberta? Like, why? What is specific to Alberta that is different or differentiates us, quote unquote, from other provinces?
Well, a lot of other provinces have had them negotiated through their bargaining process. And it's something that we've had on the bargaining table the last couple of rounds of central table bargaining. I know when I worked with the Teacher Welfare Committee when I was in my local, I worked on the Teacher Welfare Committee, the NSC, the negotiating subcommittee. Since my first year of teaching, I've been involved in bargaining. We've talked about class sizes sort of at the local level. At the end of the day, it's an expensive fix, and it's going to take government will to do it. And so you try to negotiate it and get it in place. And that's, I'm sure, will be one of the issues that teachers identify as we get into this next round of central table bargaining.
So for central table bargaining, what is that, and what does it look like?
So this came about you're going to challenge my memory on timelines here. I want to say it came in through when the NDP were in government. So I want to say around 2016, 2015. The legislation is called PECBA. It's the Public Education
so
Collective
how would they have
Bargaining Act.
negotiated for an overall provincial contract prior?
We would have done it local by local.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we have 55 locals that would negotiate collective agreements for 55 different areas.
Okay.
And that's when you would see, instructional time, for example. You had it in Calgary Catholic, the Edmonton areas, and some of the larger locals had instructional time. A lot of smaller locals didn't. And having bargained for 20 years or so with a smaller local, just could never get instructional time like our colleagues in the cities would have. So.
Okay. So what do you mean by, what was the difference in instructional time? You had more or less?
We had none. We had no provisions in our collective agreement on instructional time.
Oh.
It was whatever the board wanted to do.
Okay.
Right? And, in Palliser where I was at, it wasn't outrageous. It wasn't anything that was, we weren't working, 600-700 hours more than our counterparts in Calgary. It's just we didn't have the protection of that provision in our collective agreement.
Okay.
So PECBA, which is the legislation, came in 2016. So we have to first, bargain the list of what we're going to bargain.
So
it's complicated. It gets try to explain it as easily as you can for folks, right? So you have to bargain first what you're going to bargain. So we go into central table bargaining, what we call list bargaining. And that's just saying this will be bargained centrally, this will be bargained locally. PECBA sort of oversees that. So anything according to the legislation that is of a high cost or impacts a lot of districts within Alberta would go central. So that's why wages went central, benefits, leaves, a lot of things went centrally because
just core teacher.
Yeah, because it affects every board, right?
Yeah.
And their wages or benefits have a high cost to boards, so they would go in that direction. Other items would go locally, so sometimes you'll see in the list right now, you have a lot of substitute teacher issues or locally, things that can be handled better in that context. So you don't see it too much in the city, and I'm not sure if you have it in Fort McMurray, but impassable road clauses. So when you live out in rural areas like I do, a winter storm comes through, you can't always get to school because the roads are closed or, the buses aren't running. So there's clauses like that are sometimes bargained locally. So then the process goes, central table bargaining goes through the process. Once that is settled, then you have 30 days, and then local bargaining starts. And that's where we are right now, trying to wrap up local bargaining before central table bargaining starts again in January. So
you're always looking for a bargain, clearly.
Well, this is a part of the problem with PECBA is that it kind of drags out the bargaining process.
Okay.
And it takes so long. We're always bargaining. And when I chaired the central table bargaining committee in the 2018-2020 round, we lapped a couple of the locals because they were still working with their boards. Their boards were dragging their heels to get a local settlement done. And we started central table bargaining before we had wrapped up all the local table bargaining. And there's a lot of issues there around the legislation. It was put in 2015, but it's never really had people sit down and look at it and say what's working here, what's not working here. I don't know if this government's the one I want to sit down and have that conversation with, but there are always things that need to be improved and tweaked as we move forward. Okay.
And so when I was talking to one of my colleagues the other day about that I was going to have a conversation with you, I said, what are some topics, ideas, et cetera, that we could talk about? And it was actually remarkable what they said, because they said, there's already solutions to all of these problems. We're just not being listened to. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's accurate? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So what are some of the ones right now that you just, I think, are no-brainers that just are being rejected?
Oh, well, let me get my book and look at my list. I mean, class size is one of them, right?
So what is the desirable class size? Is it like a staggered 25 and then at slightly smaller as you go down through the younger grades?
There's a variety of ways to look at it. And I know that we used to have, this would be back, you're probably in junior high when this happened, but maybe, I don't know, you weren't even born at that point. But in 2002, when we had strike action by several locals within the province, we got the Alberta Commission on Learning that came out of the strike. So it was we'll have this Commission on Learning, we'll look at one of these issues. Mm-hmm. And one of the issues was class size, right? And so this is where we got
21 years later.
This is where we got the ACO guidelines, and the guidelines had numbers set out for different divisions. So K-3 was 17, and then it went up to 20, I think, for Division 4, and then or Division 2, and then I think Division 4, which would be high school, would be 27. Yeah. Those were just guidelines and suggestions, and so there was never any really had a lot of teeth behind it to put it in place. And you're trying to bargain those into collective agreements to give them some formality. The government got into funding for class size, and it was supposed to be from K to 12, and then it just got narrowed down into Division 1, so K to 3. And people talk, it's interesting, they'll talk about class size funding, but other elements of the budget were kept flat. So transportation didn't see any increases. The operational part of the budgets didn't see any increases. So then boards started doing a little bit of a shell game with their budgets. Their class size money had to be used to pay for buses, or
because they only funded a part of it.
Yeah, because only part of it was funding. So funding is really one of the biggest issues. And when we talk about a lot of the concerns that we have, funding is is the core to a lot of it.
And so with the funding part, because I've seen a few of your posts and just kind of the general discourse on education right now, that Alberta pays the lowest amount per student. I think it's $13,000. I think in the top, I don't know which province it is $18,000. Is that correct?
I think the Alberta number is lower than that.
Okay, is it 11 maybe?
I think it's around 11,000. It's under $12,000. So the Canadian average is around the $12,000 range. So we fund our students the least in Canada. We used to fund our students the most. And that's changed in the last couple of years. And what we needed to see in February of this year, 2023, so we're going back a ways, and another fiscal year ago, $1.2 billion in the education budget to bring us to the Canadian average. Not to make us number one in the country, to bring us to the Canadian average. You saw an increase in the budget, but it was only $400 million. So we're still shy of that funding. So when you saw this $30 million increase announced by the government a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's a drop in the bucket of what we needed. And the urban boards pretty much, that money went to them because they have exploding class sizes in the city, and they reached this formula that they could get this money. So it doesn't really help places like Fort McMurray or, we call it the donut around Edmonton, Sherwood Park, St. Albert, Rocky View, Medicine Hat has some increasing numbers, Brooks. There's lots of areas in the province are seeing growth.
And they're growing at a faster rate than like the major cities, would you say? Is it kind of like a suburban movement, or is like
it's more of an urban movement right now? You're seeing probably 20,000 new students just in between Edmonton and Calgary alone. Wow. A big growth in Airdrie. Smaller, not smaller growth, but higher percentage of growth in areas around the cities. So there's just a lot of growth in the system. So they don't account for growth in the funding. And they don't account really for inflation either, which has put a lot of pressures on school boards as well.
And so what was your interpretation of kind of the teacher participation at like an overall level? Because I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, the last ATA vote, because I was actually just finishing last practicum, starting out an 9-week temporary placement to finish out the year, when it was the vote for, I think it was a 3.75% raise over 2 years. Is that correct?
But the mediator's recommendations to our bargaining. So when we were bargaining central table the last round, we'd settled on some things that you write off through the bargaining process, and you agree through it as you're
What do you mean write off?
You just sign off on it. So if you say, well, we agree on this one issue, this is what we're going to do, we'll sign off on that. And so there was parts of the last round of central table that were agreed to by both parties, the government and teachers. And then there was parts where we couldn't agree on. And then a mediator came in, and the mediator gave their recommendations as to what they thought could be a solution to this problem. Mediator's recommendations often make nobody happy, right?
Okay, yeah,
right? Because they're trying to find a balance between what they're asking. So we had the vote on the mediator's recommendations. We had about 50% of our teachers vote at that time.
Is that like normal? Or is that low? Was that high?
It's about the same.
Voter turnout.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Voter, and and I hear debate too out there. Do we have electronic voting? Do we have paper ballot voting? What will get more engagement? Part of that, I think people are used to electronic voting. We've been doing it for our last couple of rounds of bargaining. We do it locally on bargaining in some areas as well. That's a really big conversation, and that's what we've been addressing this year, was to engage our school council reps, so our school, we call them our CSRs, to get out into schools, to have meetings, and sort of launch this year as we get into central table bargaining, kind of I call it bargaining 101.
Okay, yeah.
Right? Because what I saw through the mediators recs were a lot of people were engaged, but there was a lot of misinformation about what bargaining is, what the process is, what are the steps are, right? What does this mean in terms of PECBA's legislation? What does it mean in terms of labor code? What does it mean in terms of, this part? And so some people had a lot of misinformed ideas about what was happening.
So do you have an example? Like what would have been a misinformed idea versus what was actually happening that was kind of going around?
Well, there's different processes and steps that you take to get to like job action or a strike, right? And some people think you go from A to Z and you turn this down and, we're going on strike. Well, no, there's other steps in the process where you would go back, the mediator would come back, they could write out.
The work to rule is kind of like
rule is a job action as well.
So when it comes to job action, like you have obviously strike is the end, like result that everyone's kind of avoiding. You have work to rule is kind of the in-between. Is there anything else in those as like kind of typical job action things that you're doing?
You can escalate that up.
So what do you mean by like, what would it be an example of escalating?
Well, with our members, when we talk about, it's kind of like a ladder of escalation, right? Is getting informed, knowing what the issues are. So there's work that's required by the membership and by the association as well to inform members, which we do that work, and members have to engage in that as well. But when you get into the bargaining, so for instance, we have a couple locals here. turned down what was proposed. And so then they go into what's called an authorization for a strike vote. That puts more pressure onto the parties at the bargaining table to come back and to try to find some sort of solution to the deal. If they can't do that, then you reject that, and then the mediator could write out at that point, and then you have a cooling off period, and then you go into some sort of job action. Now it could be, it's a variety of things that are out there. You could see work to rule was one of them, and we did that after the 2002 strike. We did sort of that action. It's not easy, right? And people don't like it because, you're withholding things from kids, and a lot of teachers at that time were like, well, I still want to do XYZ with my students. I'm like, that's not what work to rule is, right? You're doing just what your job is supposed to be, and that's it. Nothing on top of that. So it's really challenging. And in 2002, when we came back after the strike, we were ordered back. We were legislated back at that time. We did the work to rule part, and it was very divisive on staff. I remember working on our staff, and some people were going to do this and some people weren't, and it caused a lot of problems. It took a lot of time to heal those afterwards. We were on strike for 3 weeks, and
so when you were on strike as a teacher yourself, so what was that period like for you? Like, what was how did the environment kind of change, and were you fairly new at that time?
I'd only been teaching for 5 years at that point.
Okay.
And it was challenging because I probably didn't have the funds put away to go without income for that time. So now as we're talking to teachers, we're like, you need to start looking at your finances. If we're going through the next round of bargaining, the whole point is bargaining should try to get to the solutions to the problems that we want to see. You want to try to get them through negotiations. You need the round to go as it should. Right. But you also have to prepare. So probably as a young teacher, 5 years in, car payment, student loans. I didn't own a house then. I was renting and living in Vulcan, which was fine. This is a while ago. My rent wasn't exactly super high at that point. But and it was a challenge just being in a small town. Vulcan was a town of 1,200 people. And so everybody knows who the teachers are in that town. But we had a lot of support from parents at that time. And that was really good to see. And and it was, like I said, I was on the negotiating subcommittee because I've been involved with bargaining since my first year of teaching. Okay. And so I was at the strike
why
headquarters.
Why did you kind of get involved in that? Like, what kind of sparked you? Was it because it was a smaller town? They were just kind of like looking place for people to fill in gaps, or was that an interest of yours from the start?
When I was student teaching, I worked with a woman in Colehurst. Sorry, it's cold there in Colehurst. So I had a little brain moment there. Colehurst. She was actually the chair of the Teacher Welfare Committee. We called them the EP. They were the Economic Policy Committee back then. And they've had a name change since then. But she was the chair of the ECP committee at the time, and I student taught with her at the University of Lethbridge. And she just said to me, you'd be good at this. Like, you should get involved in the association. This is your professional organization. You need to be involved in it. Every teacher should be, and should be, engaged with what's going on, up to date with the materials that are sent out. Read the news, check the website on a regular basis. And she's like, you should do this. I'm like, I don't have a job. And she's like, oh, you'll get a job. I'm like, I don't know if I'll get a job. Because it was right after, when I first started teaching in 96, it was a year after the 5% rollback by Ralph Klein. There wasn't a lot of jobs. And so I subbed for 2 years before I got my first full-time job. And so I was on the NSC just because Arlene sort of tapped me on the shoulder and said, you should get involved with that. And I enjoyed the work. I enjoyed the aspect of seeing that, this sort of thing, bargaining wise, is a way that we can make a positive difference for our students and our colleagues.
And so when it comes to when you started, because I very much get a make teaching great again kind of sense from teachers who are currently teaching, who are kind of more veterans that I've spoken to, are always saying teaching, it used to be so much better. But then I hear things like, oh, there was a 5% rollback and at these times. So would you agree with that? Are you kind of in the lane of things are better now or were worse then? Like, where do you kind of land on how the profession has changed in your time, generally speaking?
It's changed quite a bit, actually, from when I first started teaching. And
is it like an expectations thing, or is it just
a little bit
the pressure? Like, what is the?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. And I mean, part of it too. I had a chalkboard in my classroom when I first started teaching, like a chalkboard, right? And we don't have that. So you see a lot of pressures and changes, I think, in that aspect of the tools around teaching, right? So technology, now you have AI that's coming in that's causing a lot of teachers to go, well, what are we doing with this?
Use the Trojan horse method. If you don't know what that is, look it up.
Yeah. And then I think the expectations of what we're seeing put on teachers in their plates. And so there's a greater expectations that schools will do more for our students.
So what is the teacher plate?
The teacher plate, well, we talk about it being a scope of practice, right? And you go back to the LQS, like the TQS, the LQS is for leaders, but the teaching quality standard, that's our rules of what we should be doing in our classrooms. But we know that teachers are doing a lot of things that are above and beyond what the TQS is talking about, right? Because we've seen over the last couple of years an increase of class sizes, right? You've seen an increase in complex needs of our students. We've seen more English language learners coming into the system. We're seeing more students coming in with trauma, right? So trauma-informed practice on that as well. You're seeing teachers who are just being overwhelmed with all the things that they need to do. And then sometimes, I think of our colleagues who are teaching K-3 right now in English and math, they have to do these literacy assessments, right? And the government
my wife's a kindergarten teacher.
Yeah, and those
she fills me in all the time.
Yeah, and they want to grow those assessments into 4, 5, and 6. And I often say to the government, you can't test your way out of what you think the learning gap of the pandemic is. Actually, just let teachers work with students and we'll get them caught up that way. I said, especially, these assessments, these literacy assessments in K-3, teachers have to have them done by the end of September. Like they're supposed to be creating routines with students and building relationships with them, right? So that they understand, what school is. Yeah. But now you're testing them right away. And so it just, I think the concerns have grown over the years and it's much different from, when I first started teaching to when I left the classroom in 2019 to start this job.
Oh, okay. So it's only been about 4 years. Okay, I wasn't aware.
Yeah. So I'm in the middle of my third term. Okay. I guess not quite the middle. Yeah, we have 2-year terms, and so I'm in my third term, and
always bargaining and campaigning.
Always bargaining. Well, always bargaining, it seems. But it's interesting because we knew, part of the issue is the policies and the priorities of government. So this government, when they came in 2019, had a very specific sort of policy and direction of how they wanted to deal with public education. It meant they kept funding flat for 3 years.
Yep. It's the same amount, right, per year?
Yeah, they just kept it at the same level. It was like $8 million, just for a round number, straight through, right? We're like, but we get 12,000, 15,000 new students into our system. And then the pandemic happened, right?
So that means
everything,
even like after you kind of replace the graduation level, there's still 15 to 20,000. What's the provincial amount? Do you know, like roughly, of like the new students, like net per year?
Like you mean like the new students coming into the system, or just the ones starting?
Graduate.
Yeah,
new students come in. Like let's just say 10,000 graduate and 30,000 start. So now we have a net plus of 20,000 students.
I don't know. I wouldn't know those numbers off the top of my head. I know a lot of things, but I don't know that number off the top of my head.
You are a contemplator of things and stuff. So.
Yeah. I think isn't that my Instagram handle?
That was incredible.
So we see those numbers come in, but they also during that time rejigged the funding formula. So it used to be funding per, the September 30th number.
Yeah.
Boards would get funded that way, but boards wanted to know that these numbers beforehand, so they created what they call the weighted moving average, and so it's a formula. Right? Yeah, it's a 3-year formula that's basically funds a student over the course of 3 years. Okay. They need to be funded fully and completely the moment they walk into our schools in kindergarten or whatever grade they're coming to Alberta till they graduate, not over the course of 3 years. So That's put pressure on the boards, and then that pressure gets put onto school administrators, which then trickles down to teachers. And I think it's gotten more complicated. There's a lot more pressures on there. There's also a lot more pressure, I think, to have teachers report to parents as well.
Yeah. And that's what I think it's just become more complicated. Because I guess what I've always been saying is that, I mean, being a newer teacher, this is the normal for us. So I'm just not really sure, like, okay, this is the normal, 50% leave in 5 years. Like, what are the things where, I guess, if there's a balance of it's technically potentially possible to work to rule, but then we don't work to rule, obviously, when we're not in any sort of job action phase. Like, what are some of the things that you can kind of ease not a burden, but like kind of make it a more, like, maybe efficient's the wrong word, but like a profession that's more engaging and inviting, right?
Yeah, and you have to be careful with work to rule, because work to rule is
a form. I know.
Is a form of job action, right? Okay. And you have to get to that point beforehand. If teachers decide, well, we're going to work to rule without going through the steps that are allotted within labor code, it's bargaining in bad faith. It's illegal. Yes. It's illegal job action. You get fined for that. Yeah. Okay. So you just have to be just mindful of that.
Yes.
People
don't micro-protest yourself.
Well, no, but part of it too is I said to some of my colleagues, if I was in the classroom right now, I don't know if I'd be coaching cross country right now. Yeah. I've always coached cross country. I don't know if I need to take the 6 kids I would take to, Medicine Hat to run around Echodale. Is something I would need to do.
Cross country, so I didn't know that you were also.
So so it's just a matter of looking at the things that we're doing that you can take off your plate yourself. But teachers are, they want to do what's best for students, and so they want to give them all these opportunities. But sometimes we have to look at that ourselves and say, I only have so much bandwidth in the course of my day. And sometimes saying no is not a bad thing. No can be a sentence.
Yeah, and I do find like a lot of teachers, even in like as I'm speaking to them, because I found what was useful kind of my first year and a half or so compared to like my second year and a half was first year, I just try to do everything. And like you want to show that you are willing to be that person. But it was, okay, year 2, I took a few things off, but it was beneficial because it kind of helped me realize like what teacher I wasn't. Like I think it helps to understand that you don't have to do everything, because every teacher is going to have that lane themselves that they can do better than you could, which is not a bad thing. You don't have to feel like you need to do all of that yourself. Yeah. That's kind of my, I guess, micro nugget of, I guess, unearned wisdom at this point, but that's kind of what I've noticed a little bit. Would you kind of agree with that?
No, yeah, I think that's fair. I think that just sort of analyzing what we do. And I remember when I transferred to Coaldale, I was teaching more high school English than I had when I was in Vulcan. I marked everything.
Yeah.
Everything. And my colleague next door.
Did you mark less over time?
Well, my colleague next door to me, he's like, you're doing too much marking. I'm like, it's, I'm a high school English teacher. This is my cross to bear. This is marking is a heavy load. Yeah. He said, we had a program for our marks. He said, let's just do a little experiment. He's like, just uncheck, every third assignment in your mark book and see what happens to your students' overall grades. And they didn't change. Right. And there was a really good sort of concrete example of this colleague sort of saying to me, reconsider what you're doing in terms of your assessment and how you're assessing. And that really changed for me over the course of my career as well, where I would do a lot of peer assessment with our students and working with them. And, I would, to the beginning of my career, I'd give them a rubric, but I probably didn't spend any time talking to them about what the rubric meant or what it looked like or what I'm looking for.
Think, okay, I need a rubric, so I'm going to give you a rubric, and we're just going to...
Right, because you're just, when you're starting out, you're just trying to keep your head above water, right? And when I started teaching English, I hadn't taught some of these courses before, so probably was like a day or 2 or a week ahead of the students in terms of planning and getting things together. So just learn those sort of wisdoms through the course of my career. And that's why I'm always really a big proponent when I talk to new teachers such as yourself to if you don't have a formal mentorship program in your district or your school, find informally mentors who are going to help you through.
That's kind of the ethos of this a little bit too, is trying to talk to some of those people of like, what are the lessons you've learned throughout? So even like, what kind of sparked the interest for you of going from, okay, I've been teaching for 15, 16 years to going into governance? Because you're kind of in like a teaching governance role right now. Would you say that is an accurate description of your...
Yeah. Sometimes it feels like I'm an administrator, but I'm not technically an administrator.
Looks like I know you were in bargaining, and like there's still teachers who are also in those welfare committees and in bargaining and et cetera. But what kind of made you say, I want to run for like ATA president?
Well, it's interesting because I've always been involved in the association. I was vice president of the Education Undergraduate Society at the University of Lethbridge when I was in university. I was always involved in student union in high school, right? I've always been involved in some sort of aspect. And I think I blame my parents for it, though. They're not willing to take either the credit or the blame for it. You can hear the sirens outside. It's just for the background noise. It's not anything that I've done.
Okay, they won't find us.
But I was involved with the local in the teacher welfare committee and through bargaining, and then just involved with the local. So I would go to local meetings all the time, just as as part of the teacher welfare committee. I went to our local committee meetings. Then I became vice president of the local. And through the local, I also did I did some work as the local communications officer. I was involved in just the local aspect of that, became vice president. We had a local president, and his name was Wayne. He had been local president for a while, and so he would ask me every year, are you ready to be president? I'm like, are you ready to not be president? And he's like, no, I'd like to do one more year. And I'm like, then I'll wait until you're ready to not do this. Because, the more I can learn on other aspects of the ATA. I got involved provincially with the association around the same time as a pension consultant. We don't have this group anymore. So I got involved sort of provincially through that aspect. We'd go to our annual representative assembly, went to summer conference a couple times, and just by chance, the woman who was our district representative for the Southwest, the 6 locals down in the South, she was the representative on Provincial Executive Council for that area. She stepped down, and I had some people encourage me to run for that position, and so I did, and I won. And I got onto Provincial Executive Council in 2009. Okay. But what that meant in terms of my teaching is I taught half-time. And then I had half-time release to do the association work just because it's busy. You wouldn't be able to do both. Yeah. And then I was district representative for the area for 8 years. And then I ran as vice president for 2 because I felt like I'd sort of was done with the district representative work. I was ready either to have another challenge or to do something else entirely. During that time, I got my master's as well, so I was really enjoying that aspect of learning more.
What did you pursue a master's in?
I did a master's of educational studies here at the University of Alberta.
Okay. And educational studies, is that like a leadership or is that like a curriculum?
So leadership, I really enjoyed the program actually because the umbrella was school improvement or school leadership. But we could choose our topics. And so my topic was the coping strategies teachers create after the sudden death of a student. And that was, it was a little bit dark.
Yeah, no, but like, so why do you kind of choose that lane? Like, what did you learn from that?
I chose that lane from personal experience, actually, of having an interaction with a student very early on in my career that he had lots of issues and had a little altercation at school, threatened me. Left the building, got a gun, and unfortunately, just the way that the day folded out, we went into lockdown for 3.5 hours, and just the way that the day unfolded, he unfortunately took his own life. And so it was dealing with the after effects of that. I'd only been teaching maybe 7 years at that point, and carried the burden of that interaction and the guilt of feeling like that I had been sort of the genesis or the cause of
you
this.
Had an altercation previously.
And so I was always curious too after the fact of things happen at schools, unfortunately, and we bring in, a wealth of counselors to work with the students and to make sure their kids are okay, which we need to be doing.
Yeah.
But I was always curious about, we don't really do much for the adults in the building. And sometimes you work with these kids for 4 or 5 years. You get to know them. You get to see them grow. You get to see them learn. And then one day they're not there. And that's really, really hard to deal with.
Even just
that.
like a grad, like a general, they're no longer in the building.
Yeah.
Not even necessarily as extreme and unfortunate evidence that you had, but also just no longer seeing them anymore.
Yeah. And as soon as I started sort of telling teachers what my project was and I had to do some interviews, I was astounded by how many teachers had a similar experience. Not quite to that extreme, but had taught students who maybe became ill and passed away, or students who died by suicide, killed in car accidents. And as you start talking to them, and I'm like, okay, well, what did the district or what was done to assist you in these areas? And because I think that for some people, and it was for me very much at that year, I really debated whether or not I was going to stick with teaching. It could have been a career ender if I didn't do certain aspects. So I had a really good administrator at that time who I was struggling, and I said, I had to go to counseling to sort of deal with this because I couldn't deal with it on my own. And my appointments I got, you don't always get the luxury of choosing the time. You're like, I work till this time and I will come at this time. And they're like, no, your appointment's at 3:30.
Yeah.
And in a different town.
Oh.
Like I was teaching in Coaldale at the time and I had to come into Lethbridge. We taught till 3:27. There's no way.
I mean, you can't go that
we don't have teleportation yet
Yeah.
that I could get from Coaldale to Lethbridge to make these appointments. And so I was like, well, I guess I can't do it. And my principal was like, no. And so he came every time I had an appointment at 3 o'clock, covered my class, and so that I could leave the building and make these appointments. And it's just little things like that really piqued my interest. And so that's what sort of.
And so when you say coping strategies, are you saying how to deal with if you develop negative coping strategies, or just things to do to help you when that happens? Is that kind of what you're saying? Okay, so what were some examples of obviously, God forbid, if something were to happen with one of my students here, what would you advise me to do as a coping, a way to go and process that?
We did a bunch of research, and the secondary trauma that you see within the medical profession was one of the areas that I read quite a bit about that trauma-informed practice. When I talked to the individuals through my research, it really came out in a variety of things. The number one thing was talking to people, not to wall up, right? And to build sort of a wall of silence around you and be like, well, because what happens is everybody moves on, right? But sometimes with trauma, that trauma means that you're stuck in that moment and you relive that moment over and over again. Yeah. It didn't help I was in the same classroom where this altercation
Well, you're associating environment with incident, right?
But my counselor at the time too was like, it doesn't matter where you go. It doesn't matter if it's this classroom or if you transfer to another school, it's carrying this. Yeah. So talk was a big one. Some people talked about, counseling. Like I took that route. Some people, turned to religion. For some, it was just helping out students through the incident or helping them, handle their things, help them with that as well. So there's a variety. There was no one
and that's
method,
the thing,
right?
Well,
it was whatever works for you at that time. But part of it is recognizing that you need that help at that time, and then having the courage to ask for it, right?
Yeah, well, because the only question is because my dad passed away about 4.5 years ago, and so
sorry for that.
Yeah, that's okay. But afterwards, it was almost a few months went by, and I was like, okay, I need to talk to someone, because my thing was, I don't know what I don't know. Kind of I don't know if this is affecting me in ways that I don't even actually realize I have myself. I think that was a moment where I'm wondering now, was there a difference of when it comes to grieving a student loss versus a family loss? Did that ever come up in your research? What is the difference? I know it's a different, because we are in loco parentis, we are kind of taking on that kind of semi-parental role. But what is that difference? Or
they didn't really jump into that. I mean, I'm fortunate I have both my parents now, but grief is a funny thing, right? We all deal with it differently and separately, and some people need to process it sort of on a quieter, they're more introverted, some are a little bit louder, they're more extroverted. And so it's really just recognizing what you need, and then making sure that as a profession, we have the supports in place to help people.
Well, because even with your situation, like, I'm surprised that there wasn't the available like substitutes to help fill in that class. I mean, unless there weren't.
There probably were, but it was only a half an hour, right?
Yeah. And so that makes sense.
Yeah. So my principal, I taught all day till 3:00, and then my principal came to my classroom, and he's like, "Okay, you got to go." And the kid's like, "Where is he going? What's he doing?" I was very open with my students too at the time that I was going to a counselor because of and they all knew what had happened at school. They'd all been in lockdown for 3 hours.
That probably helped, I guess, because I'm assuming, I don't think the stigma is as much there now. And I know I don't want to get into like a trauma stigma conversation because that's a very commonly known, maybe not our topic, but yeah. I do think there's less of did you kind of feel like a pressure to not go see one? Did you feel like you were, I think it's good to be open with your students with that kind of stuff.
I was very open with them about it. I was open with the staff about it, just because I was exhibiting symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, right? So I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating, I wasn't an enjoyable person to be around. I was quick to temper, and I wasn't a good teacher, and I probably wasn't a very good person at the time. And I wanted to not be that person anymore. So I just sort of was like, you know what? And it was interesting because I would mention something to friends or something about it. Like I was struggling in certain areas, and they'd be like, "Over what?" And I'm like, "Well, this thing that happened." They're like, "Oh, that was like months ago. Are you still worried about that?"
Months is not a lot,
right? And that's what I mean by when you
the subjective
that trauma,
experience,
right?
Everyone assumes like
you're stuck in that
way,
moment, and everybody moves on. So as we have students who are coming in from traumatized situations into our classrooms, we have these kids who have these really complicated things going on in their lives, and we don't have the supports in place like counseling or mental health supports to address that. Because if we could address that, then that changes and alters their behavior in class, right? So I learned some coping strategies myself. I run, so I ran a lot during that time, and then we did some work to try to get me to sleep more, and it was a bit of quite honestly, it was a relief when I kind of bit the bullet and went in and said, "I'm in trouble," and they're like, "You are?" So I went every week for months, and then it was every 2 weeks, and then there was at one point I remember I'm like, "Well, I think I'm good. I'm cured," right? And my therapist at the time, he said, he was like, "You think so?" And I'm like, and he's like, "Why?" And I was like, "Yeah,
I'm laughing with you. I
no, that's fine. No, because it was kind of a funny moment because I was feeling better. Like I was feeling more like myself again. I was interacting. It was better. And so he just said to me, he's like, "Okay, I'm just going to pretend I'm a student right now, Jason." I'm like, "Okay, go ahead. Right? Don't write your name on something, right?" And he just grabbed my arm and he said, "I'm thinking I'm going to kill myself." And I fell apart. And I was like, "All right, I'll see you next week." Right? It's just like, I'm not. Month. I wasn't ready. And then it took about a year this is a different turn on the podcast you probably weren't expecting to go.
No, that's all right.
No, it took about a year, and then I met with him, and it was, I didn't have to go much after that, and it just sort of weaned off, and we, in that anniversary of the incident, we called it at school, we just turned it around into something that was more positive than sort of a negative. And that was helpful. And I was very fortunate to have a staff that I worked with that supported me.
Yeah,
right? They had my back through everything.
It's probably a pretty small school as well.
Yeah, we were a staff of about 22 teachers at the time, but I know they brought in some counselor sort of 6 months, second semester, and talking about things to look for in the students, because our students were quite traumatized by this as well.
And they would be less likely have less self-awareness of kind of how they're changing compared to someone who's a little bit older and more attuned.
Yeah. And she's talking about all these things. And I said to my colleague afterwards, I felt like everybody was looking at me. He was like, "They are." Like, we are all watching you like a hawk to make sure that we're here to support you through this. And yeah, I was really fortunate that I had such a good staff behind me at that point.
Yeah, because I've even noticed, not that there's like a bad things, I do find I like being at a bigger school. 'Cause we have almost 1,600 students at like where I'm teaching in Fort McMurray, but we have over 70 ATA staff.
Yeah.
So it's a very large school. So, I mean, fortunately, we haven't had an incident like that, but it would be interesting to see like what would occur if it did. Because like we almost have like a junior high school divide. Like would it be more of like a high school clique or like or vice versa if it like depending on where it happened. But so I'm going to shift gears a little bit here.
School
no,
communities,
I really
school
appreciate you
communities
sharing.
are really good about supporting one another. But yeah, that was the genesis of the work that led to my master's. And
I like that. So when are you going to let Chad Bowie light the torch?
Chad, he's one of my favorite guys. We talk about, and I've talked to Chad about that a lot of times. And I meet teachers across the province. I don't know what
lighting the torch means, though. He just said that, and I was like, okay, I'll go for it.
And there's teachers out there who are, when we talk about being an escalation of sort of job action, right? There are teachers who are ready to go.
Yeah.
Right. And then we have some of our colleagues who are just in their classrooms working, their hearts out, who are not necessarily paying attention to what the issues are, what's going on. When we did sort of a survey around the last mediators rec, a lot of our membership had indicated that they didn't know anything was going on. They didn't know there was a vote. They didn't know there was mediators recommendations to look at. Why didn't anybody say anything? And I'm like, we had tours, we had, we did everything to our means that we do as an association in different avenues. I call the modalities of communication to get that information out. So I always say to teachers, though, we have to follow the process, right, to get to that point. And then we just see what it is. And like you said earlier, strike is the last thing you want. And it's not anything actually that you do want. It's a tool, a mechanism that you can use, but you want to try to find a negotiated settlement that will address the needs that you need to address, right? And so I know he calls it lighting the torch. I call Chad the jerry can boys, right? He's ready to burn it down.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And we just have to get to that point.
No, I sure love
Chad and I have these conversations every time I see him, by the way.
And so I touched on it like a little bit because I was also talking to another colleague about asking about the efficacy of bi-level bargaining. I'm assuming that's kind of just at district level. We kind of touched on that a little bit, but any other commentary on the efficacy of it? Like, has it been kind of working so far with that kind of?
They all have it has its challenges. We had challenges with local bargaining. It would be a challenge if we just had central table bargaining only.
Yeah.
Right.
Because you wouldn't be able to account for those kind of nuances of the different areas, like the road closures. But and so we have touched on that a little bit.
Yeah, and we take our policy direction from our annual representative assembly. It's not me just sitting here in my office going, "We're going to do this," right?
Oh, really?
That's not how it works. We are a policy-driven organization, and that policy is developed by teachers, and it's voted on at our ARA. And I always say to people, I don't always agree with every decision that ARA comes up with, but once the policy's there and that decision's made, that's what I have to speak to. And we had a debate at this last year's ARA about
what is the
local
ARA,
bargaining.
Sorry?
It's our annual representative assembly.
Okay,
we had a debate about bargaining, central table versus local, and the membership voted overwhelmingly to maintain the current model that we have. Okay. And that's the decision by the teachers of the province. And so that's the decision that I am kind of bound by, and I work towards that. So when people always say to me, well, what's the ATA believe about this, or what's the ATA stance about that? My first place to go to is what does our policy say? Because teachers voted on this, and this is what it is.
Like you can't
we don't all agree on
association legislation and be like, this is where we're going.
No.
Because it's not the ATA that makes legislation. It's like we vote on legislation that you then abide by and then attempt to work around.
Our policy. So, and then this year too, like Provincial Executive Council, which is the governing body of the association, there's 19 of us on council. We can create interim policy between ARAs. And we've been doing a little bit of that this year just because we've seen certain policies passed at the the association's, the UCP's AGM.
Okay.
So we just last month passed a couple policies around the belief that your pension is yours.
Yes.
And so
Crazy idea.
it's sort of in relation to the APP,
Yep.
CPP debate that's going on in Alberta right now. We just passed some policy about saying, the teachers have autonomy and professional judgment about the literature that they're teaching in class.
Yep.
Right? Because we're seeing a bunch of book banning.
Yes.
Especially kind of in the States working its way up, right? And as a high school humanities teacher, you should have that professional judgment to bring that in and not have resource challenges.
There's almost a exposure to controversial material is kind of the point, really. Like to kind of perturb the mind a little bit. But
and there's the guide to education that has policy on how teachers deal with controversial issues in class. And then we also passed some policy earlier around the pronoun use that you're seeing. Saskatchewan and New Brunswick put some of that legislation in place. Saskatchewan used the notwithstanding clause to basically ignored the charter rights of a certain group of individuals. And so we put policy in place with that, just so that if people say, Jason, what's the ATA stance on this? I've got that in place, and council are elected to represent their members, and they talk with their local presidents, and that's how we do that in between ARAs.
And so we now have a new, same government, different ministry.
Mm-hmm.
So how has kind of the shift been? Because I've heard it's kind of been in a bit more of a positive angle with the new ministry. Is that correct?
There's a definite tone change.
So what do you mean by a tone change?
So Jason Kenney hated teachers. He hated public education. Sorry, my parents are calling me. So. It's Sunday. You talk to your parents.
Because again, because in my first year, in part of my throwing my name into everything, I was on the Minister's Teacher Advisory Council.
Oh, okay.
So we had 40 of the teachers. Yeah. 3 meetings throughout that year because they canceled the fourth one because it was the election, which is fair. And then, but it almost went in like I was just kind of listening. Because again, I don't really know what I don't know yet. And so, but it always seemed very receptive. Like I never really got but so what's your perspective?
Were you with Minister Lagrange?
Yes.
Or Nicolaides?
Lagrange. Yeah.
Yeah. So when they created the teacher advisory panel, I said to her, why? You have the Alberta Teachers Association.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
I represent 46,000 teachers across the province. If you'd like to know something that teachers are thinking,
we're here.
We're here. Engage with us in conversations. There was a chunk of time.
Almost kind of a workaround a little bit? Because I noticed that I didn't see
you also had the Parent Advisory Council, but you also have the Alberta School Councils Association, which represents parents from across the province. We meet with Lagrange probably for 18 months at one point. And so when I
didn't meet, or you?
We did not meet. Wow. We have a very rocky relationship with the previous minister, and I'm okay with that.
Okay, yeah.
Right? Because I think that government was creating, and it's never really about the individual, it's about government policy. Government was creating policy that was not supportive of public education. The whole curriculum development without including the association or teachers involved into the curriculum redesign. Budget is a policy, right? That didn't have funding increases to match inflation or growth. The Choice in Education Act, which deregulated charter schools. So anybody could have a charter school, which gets 100% of funding, which takes money away from the public system. The whole removing the regulatory process from the association. We'd been working with government on trying to improve, modernize and improve the process that we have, because we saw some things that needed to be changed to make it better.
So how have those things changed with the newer ministry now?
Well, and the last point of the regulatory thing is we've been working on some stuff, and then all of a sudden Minister Lagrange is in the news saying the ATA can't be trusted to do this, and we're going to take the process away. And I was like, okay, well, that's not what we were talking about yesterday, but all right. Yeah. So when we met with the new minister, just laid all this out. Yep. These are the things. These are the government was very quick to vilify teachers and to demoralize teachers.
And and another thing that's been a change that people have said is that there's a lack of trust toward educators now compared to 20 years ago. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do you walk that back? Is there a way to restore that?
Well, and there's a bit of a, like I said, there's a bit of a tone change with the government. So you don't
Softened
see
a little
them.
bit.
You don't see the Premier Smith, like Premier Kenney, vilifying teachers in the press, right? You don't see the Minister of Education right now doing the same thing. He's big on communication and having conversations. I've met with him more in the last 6 months that he's been minister than I met with Lagrange probably in the last 3 years. Now, having good conversations is one thing.
Yeah.
Moving and finding solutions is another thing.
But a lot of conversational groundwork is going to help. It's not going to hurt that.
Yeah, and even just in my last meeting with them that I had this week, talked about this idea of trust.
Yeah.
Right? I'm not a liar, right?
Yeah.
I tell the truth. When teachers tell me these are the things that is going on within their work life, those are the things I relay to the minister or other stakeholders that we meet with. And sometimes they don't like to hear it. And I'm like, well, this is what I'm hearing.
I can lie to you. And
I'm
we
not.
can be,
I can lie to you and say everything's fine, but I would not be able to sleep at night or live with myself if that was the context. And so sometimes, people are like, "Oh, he's so cranky. He's always critiquing all the time." Well, this is what I'm hearing, because we know solutions to make things better.
Yeah.
Teachers know what they need in the course of their workday to make things better for students and for themselves. Those are the things that we try to advocate to get them to move on right now. And those are some of the things that will be probably up when we bargain as well.
Okay. All right. One more question to ask you, sir.
Yeah.
So one of my favorite quotes I've ever heard was, "Education is what remains once we forgot everything that we learned in school." What is it that you want people to take away from their time with you outside of when you were a teacher and kind of actually teaching them curriculum content, and now as president representing us, like, what do you want people to take away from their experience with you?
Oh, that's a big question.
So I've heard some saying like, I want people to know like they're loved, that we're looking after them. I want you to know, like, don't be afraid to learn. Like, what are some things like your main hopeful takeaway?
I always think sometimes I get critiqued and criticized from members and from others that I'm too optimistic sometimes.
Okay. See, I see nothing wrong with that.
Right?
Go for
or hopeful. And I think that there's always an element of hope in everything that we do, because I've said it several times in different speaking engagements, that hope is, comes from when we work together towards something that's better and brighter. Right? And so really, if they're listening to this or they interact with me, would be that idea that we need to work together on elements to make the profession better, to make public education better for our students, to make our working lives better. Like, we need to be working together. And so sometimes people will be like, well, I'm a jerry can boy. I want to burn it down now. And I'm like, well, we have to get to that place, but we have to get to that place together.
Yes.
And this was one of the,
we don't want to divide ourselves.
And people will work to divide you as well. And that's what we saw with this previous government, is the same government. It's like a new restaurant under new management, right? It's like a restaurant under new management. So the new managers want to do this, but the previous managers were quick to try to divide the membership. And it didn't help that we were all sort of individually coping with a pandemic at the time. And
I've tried to empathize as much as possible, because obviously there's no justification for any sort of negative connotations and damaging the narrative toward the education profession. But so much was happening during that entire government's kind of time in office. How do you even manage all that? But again, not trying to excuse anything, but yeah.
No, it was a lot.
Yeah.
Right. And it was a government that,
because you would have started this right when COVID hit, right?
I started in the summer of 2019.
Okay. So not very long. And you were like, cool.
Yeah. And it was dealing with things I never thought of dealing with. And people would be, Jason, what's the AT's stance on this? What are you doing about this? I'm like, well, the first thing we're going to do is finish listening to the press conference. Right. And then figure out what it is they're asking. Because people would, I'm watching the press conference at the same time as everybody else, going, what are you going to do about this?
They're not done yet.
And I'm like, I'm going to watch the press conference first. And then we're going to look at what it says. And then we were making decisions around things that
When you're making decisions
that
like
were changing
super fast,
sometimes, especially in March 2020 before everybody went to that online teaching situation. It was changing hourly.
Yes.
What we had decided we were going to do was, whoops, that doesn't count.
Just kidding.
Oh yeah, exactly. And so then it was just trying to navigate and make sure that, at the end of the day that people were safe, that we could still teach as best as we could under the circumstances, to be easy on yourself through that part as well, because there was a lot of people who were like, I don't feel like I'm doing it. I'm like, you're doing what you can, and that's all we can ask right now. Right. But at the end of the day, back to your question, is really to work together on things and to have...
And that positive things can come from that. Like you should be optimistic about that collective endeavor.
Yeah. Because we are collective. Our strength is within our unity. Yeah. Right. And I'm challenging members right now as well to become more involved, to pay attention, to read the ATA news, to check the website, to be engaged in the profession, because if we get to a bargaining situation,
and we have
we need an engaged
again,
membership.
It does hurt our bargaining position when we only a third of our profession, or of 46,000 of us, if only 10,000 engaged. Well, it's like it does definitely limit our.
And I hear that
agency.
sometimes from people like, oh well, only 10% of your membership voted in this. So do you really represent the teachers of Alberta? I'm like, yeah.
But whether they like it or not.
Well, I hear from the ones that don't like it. So it's just, we need to be engaged. That's our strength comes from our unity in that. And we need to work on that. And we're working on that aspect as the association through, district reps and through our locals, but we also need the membership to become engaged as well. As hard as it is, I know they're busy. But it's finding a couple
moments of time. This is the root of the busyness, so like that part should definitely be considered. But all right, beautiful. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me.
Hello again, everyone. Just wanted to say thank you for taking the time to listen to our conversation here today. If there are any issues with professional conduct or you would like to share your own story, experience, or have something you would like to contribute to the show, please reach out at mrclark@gmail.com or send a direct message on Instagram to @mrclark.afterdark. Hope you all enjoyed, potentially found something of use, and of course, please do not forget to subscribe. See you next time, unless you're scared.